it's wild to think how much has changed, like just in our lifetimes, you know?
It really is.
I mean, we went from dial-up and waiting forever for pages to load to having basically all the world's information like right there in our pockets.
Yeah.
And social media blew up and like totally changed how we connect with each other. And now it feels like almost overnight we've got GenAI, generative AI. What's really crazy to me is how fast it's become part of like everything, even faster than the internet itself, it seems like.
You're absolutely right. The adoption rate is unlike anything we've ever seen. And that speed, I think, brings up a really important question.
What's that?
How is this technology, this stuff that can process and create information in these incredible ways, how is it changing how we think on a fundamental level?
Okay, yeah.
How we solve problems, learn new things, express our creativity. That's what we're going to really get into today.
Exactly. And it's like, on the one hand, you see all this amazing potential, right? Boosting productivity, opening up all these new creative avenues, maybe even making learning more personalized.
Yeah.
But then there's also this kind of, I don't know, this nagging worry, especially when we think about what this could be doing to our own, like, mental skills in the long run, especially I think for anyone who's, you know, just starting out with something new.
And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive.
Yeah.
We want to really try to understand what effects GenAI is having on how our minds work.
Okay.
How it's influencing our thinking processes, our learning. And, you know, for you, our listener, who's all about getting a deep understanding, but without, you know, getting bogged down in all the minutia.
Right.
We want to figure out what this all means for how we can best support our own cognitive growth. You know, how can we keep learning and thinking effectively in this age of AI?
So where do we even start with all of this?
Well, I think it makes sense to begin with how we get information in the first place.
Yeah.
Like, how is GenAI changing how we find and process knowledge?
Okay, that's a good place to start. So, like, how is it different? I mean, I know I use Google differently now with all the AI stuff.
Right. Well, think about how we used to look things up, you know, back in the day.
Yeah, like typing in keywords, right?
Exactly. Traditional search engines kind of forced us to be active participants.
Okay.
We had to, like, figure out the right search terms.
Right.
Sift through a bunch of different websites, decide what was reliable and what wasn't, put the pieces together ourselves to make sense of it all.
Yeah.
And now you have these GenAI search systems like Perplexity, Search GPT, or Microsoft Copilot. They do things very differently. They take information from tons of sources and then give you, like, this synthesized, structured answer.
So instead of me clicking on a bunch of links and trying to figure out who to trust, the AI is giving me a summary that's already, like, ready to go.
Right.
I mean, that sounds incredibly convenient.
Oh, for sure.
But is there a downside to that?
Well, the main risk, I'd say, is that we shift from actively seeking and evaluating information to more passively consuming it.
Okay.
And when the AI is doing all the synthesizing for you, you might not be as engaged in, you know, questioning the source material.
Right.
Thinking about the biases, the reliability of the original sources.
Yeah.
And you might end up with a narrower view of the topic because the AI, in its synthesis, could unintentionally be prioritizing certain perspectives and, you know, downplaying others.
Yeah, that makes sense. I could see how I might just accept the AI's answer without thinking as critically as I would if I was looking at, you know, separate websites and stuff.
Right.
You mentioned something about echo chambers before.
Yes, that's a big concern.
Yeah.
We know that people naturally tend to gravitate towards information that already confirms what they believe, right? And GenAI can actually make this worse.
Oh, okay.
There's some research by Sharma and some other folks, and it suggests that when people use these GenAI search tools, they tend to focus more on the responses that align with their own views.
So they kind of ignore the stuff that challenges their opinions.
Yeah, and they even remember those agreeable responses better than the ones that challenge their views.
Wow, that's interesting. So the AI, by learning what I like and dislike, could end up just feeding me more of what I already think.
Exactly. It's like a personalized echo chamber. Yeah. And there's another layer to this that we need to consider.
What's that?
So GenAI search, they often take what we might call a populistic approach.
Populistic.
Meaning they prioritize the perspectives that are already most widely held.
Okay.
Now that can be useful for common queries, but it also means that less mainstream information, even if it's valuable, might get pushed aside.
Right.
And that can be a problem. It can lead to, like, a suppression of diversity. Different voices, different languages, cultural practices, ways of understanding the world.
So it's not just about my own biases. It could actually contribute to, like, a more standardized, less diverse information landscape overall.
Exactly. We might lose access to a wider range of ideas.
Okay, that's a little scary, honestly. So we've talked about how we get information. Now let's talk about how we actually use it. Like, how does all this easily accessible, synthesized information affect how we think and make decisions in general?
Yeah, that's a crucial question. And some early research is starting to shed some light on that. There was a survey done with university students, for example.
Okay.
And they basically reported feeling like there was a link between their increased use of AI and a decline in their own decision-making skills.
Oh, wow.
And they also reported an increase in what they called laziness.
Laziness in, like, a mental sense?
Yeah, exactly. And another study by Klingbeil and his team found that people tend to over-rely on advice that's generated by AI.
Okay.
Even when that advice goes against their own reasoning or the specific details of a situation.
So, like, they know better, but they still follow the AI.
It seems that way.
Yeah.
And what's particularly interesting is that simply knowing the advice came from AI seems to make people more likely to trust it and act on it.
That's a little unsettling. It's like we're outsourcing our judgment to a machine, even when, like, our gut feeling or logic is telling us something different.
Yeah, I can see why you'd say that. And this gets even more concerning when we start talking about misinformation.
Right.
Because research has shown that when you have these deceptive explanations that are generated by AI, they can really sway people's beliefs.
Oh, wow.
Make us more likely to believe fake news and less likely to trust real information.
So not only might we be less critical of where we get our information, but we might also be easier to manipulate, like more easily convinced by things that the AI makes up.
Right, exactly. So it's a potentially powerful combination of risks.
Okay, well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about learning. We've been talking about how we get information, but how is all this affecting the actual process of, like, learning and retaining information over time?
Yeah, that's an important distinction.
Yeah.
Just because GenAI can make it super easy to find information doesn't mean that translates into actually learning and retaining it.
Right.
Take this study that looked at a writing task as an example.
Okay.
They found that using a tool like ChatGPT could make the writing better right then and there.
Okay.
But it didn't actually help people understand the subject matter better.
So I could write a really good paper using AI.
Right.
But I haven't actually learned the stuff in the paper.
Exactly. You might get a good grade, but you haven't really built that lasting knowledge.
Yeah.
And that's a big concern, this idea of skill atrophy.
Your skill atrophy.
Yeah, it's the idea that if we rely on AI to do certain things for us all the time, we might actually get worse at doing those things ourselves.
Oh, interesting.
And this is really relevant in education, like in programming, for instance.
Okay.
Some studies have found that while using AI tools like code generators or AI feedback can help students complete their assignments, it can actually hurt their development of those basic problem-solving skills.
So they get good at using the AI, but not good at programming itself.
Right, especially for beginners. They might really struggle when they don't have that AI assistance anymore.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like using a calculator so much that you forget how to do basic math.
Exactly. And what's really striking is that students often think they're learning more than they actually are when they use these AI tools.
Really?
Yeah, they might mistake how easy it is to complete a task with actually understanding the concepts.
Oh, wow.
There was a study in math education that showed a similar thing.
Okay.
Students who were using AI-assisted tutoring, they did well in the short term. But when they took away the AI, they had a much harder time. So it seems like actually struggling a bit, actively working through a problem, is a key part of learning.
Yeah.
And AI might be letting us skip that crucial step.
Okay, I get it. So now let's talk about creativity, because that's a place where GenAI is getting a lot of attention.
Right.
How is it changing how we define and express creativity?
It's definitely making us rethink things. On the one hand, there's research by Doshi and Hauser. They found that people who weren't considered very creative writers could actually write more engaging stories with the help of GenAI.
Interesting.
But there was a trade-off. The diversity of the stories went down. The AI-assisted stories were more similar to each other than the stories written by people without AI.
So, like, individual creativity might get a boost, but the overall pool of ideas might become less interesting?
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. And Peschel, he argues that these GenAI models are actually inherently risky when it comes to true creativity.
How so?
Well, he says they mainly just draw on and recombine what already exists.
Okay.
And that could lead to this kind of feedback loop where we just see the same patterns over and over again.
Like an echo chamber, but for creativity.
Exactly. Now, Kumar and his colleagues have a bit of a different take. They think these LLMs, large language models, the tech behind a lot of GenAI, are better for convergent thinking.
Convergent thinking.
Yeah, like finding the single best solution to a problem that's already well-defined. But they actually think it can make divergent thinking harder.
And divergent thinking is like?
It's more about exploring, brainstorming, lots of different ideas, coming up with unusual solutions.
Okay.
And, if we think about Sternberg's idea that creativity is a skill you have to practice, then relying too much on GenAI could actually make us less creative in the long run.
Because we're not using our own creative muscles as much.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's talk about metacognition and critical thinking.
Yeah, those are really important in this whole AI landscape.
It feels like the AI is doing the critical thinking for us sometimes.
And that's exactly the problem.
Okay.
There was a recent survey of knowledge workers, and it found that the more confident people were about using GenAI, the less they thought about their own critical thinking skills.
Like they felt like they didn't need to think as critically because the AI was doing it for them.
Yeah. And in education, there's a big concern about cognitive offloading.
Cognitive offloading.
It's basically when students let the AI do the thinking for them, like analyzing information or coming up with ideas.
Right.
Now, it might make the assignments easier in the short term.
Sure.
But it means they're not really engaging with the material themselves.
And that's a problem because...
Well, studies have found that using AI tools too much is linked to worse critical thinking skills.
Okay. Yeah.
And it seems like cognitive offloading is a big part of that.
So by letting the AI do the heavy lifting, we might actually be making ourselves less able to think critically and evaluate information on our own.
Right. And Prather and his colleagues did a study with new programmers. They found that using GenAI tools could actually make it harder for them to think about their own thinking, especially the students who were already struggling.
So it's not just about thinking critically about the information itself, it's also about being aware of how we're thinking.
Exactly. And that highlights how important it is to teach people how to, think about their own thinking.
Yeah.
And how to use these AI tools in a way that helps them learn instead of replacing their own thinking altogether.
Right, right. So to kind of understand all of this better, you mentioned Bloom's revised taxonomy and Dewey's theory of reflective thinking. Can you explain how those frameworks help us make sense of what's happening with AI and our brains?
Sure. So Bloom's revised taxonomy is all about the different types of knowledge and cognitive processes involved in learning.
Okay.
And it helps us see how AI is changing the relationship between what we know and how we process that knowledge.
Okay.
Like GenAI makes it so much faster to access factual and procedural knowledge.
Right. I mean, it's amazing how quickly you can get an answer to almost anything now.
Exactly. But in the past, learning was often a much slower, more deliberate process. You'd have to search through different sources, really think things through. And the worry now is that this super fast access might be making us skip over some really important cognitive processes.
Okay, so what kind of processes are we talking about?
Well, things like remembering important information, applying concepts to new situations, analyzing different viewpoints, and even just evaluating whether information is good or bad.
Right.
We usually engage those processes more actively when we have to really work to learn something.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But by letting AI handle some of that, we might miss out on strengthening those basic skills, which are also super important for building metacognitive skills.
Right, right. So can you give me an example, to help me understand this better?
Sure. Think about a programmer who's just starting out. Without AI, they'd have to really understand the problem, use their knowledge to find a solution, try different coding approaches, and decide which one works best. But with AI, they can just get the code directly, and they might miss out on that whole process of active engagement.
So the actual struggle is a valuable part of learning.
Exactly. When something is hard, we have to think harder. But over-relying on GenAI can make everything too easy, and then we don't engage those deeper metacognitive processes.
And you said this is called metacognitive laziness.
Yeah, it's that tendency to just let AI do the thinking for us instead of building up our own mental strategies. And younger people, those who are just starting to learn something, seem particularly susceptible to that.
But you mentioned earlier that experts might use AI differently.
Right. Because experts already have that deep knowledge in their field, they're often in a better position to use GenAI for more complex things. They know what questions to ask. They can critically evaluate what the AI gives them.
Okay.
And they can offload those more routine tasks to the AI, which can free up their mental energy for more creative and strategic thinking. It's almost like having a really advanced research assistant.
So in a way, AI can help experts become even better at what they do.
Potentially, yes. Some researchers even think AI could be used for a kind of Socratic dialogue, where it asks questions that help the expert learn and grow. But even for experts, there's that danger of over-reliance.
Okay.
If they're not careful, they might stop practicing the skills they need to stay at the top of their game.
Right. Now, what about Dewey's theory of reflective thinking? How does GenAI fit into that?
So Dewey believed that we learn best by actively thinking about our experiences. And he outlined these key ingredients for reflective thinking.
Okay.
Like feeling confused or doubtful, which makes you want to figure things out, drawing on what you already know, considering different ideas, not jumping to conclusions, and being able to connect different concepts. And GenAI can actually mess with some of these ingredients.
How so? It seems like AI could help clear up confusion really quickly.
And that's the first problem. It might solve the initial confusion so fast that we don't experience that cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, that feeling of discomfort when you run into something you don't understand. And that discomfort is actually what motivates us to think more deeply and learn more.
Oh, that's interesting.
And because GenAI is trained on all this existing data, it tends to reflect those dominant viewpoints and even has these biases built in. So it might actually reinforce our current beliefs instead of challenging us to consider new perspectives, which is really important for reflective thinking.
Yeah, I can see that. If the AI just tells me what I already think, I'm not going to question myself very much.
Right. And another issue is that those LLM responses are often presented very confidently. Because they're always right. And that can discourage us from really thinking critically and questioning things.
Yeah.
Even when AI gives us explanations, we might not process them as deeply as we would if we had to work things out ourselves. And we might miss mistakes or important details. And then, because AI responses are usually so well organized and clear, we might feel like we understand something fully when we actually don't.
So we think we've learned something, but we haven't really.
Right. It goes back to that overestimation of learning that we talked about earlier.
Wow, it sounds like AI can really undermine our ability to think deeply, even though it seems to be making things easier.
Yeah, it's a real paradox. And it's important to remember that this isn't happening in a vacuum.
What do you mean?
Well, there are other things going on in society that can make these AI impacts even worse, like chronic stress and anxiety, which are unfortunately pretty common these days.
Right.
We know those can already make it harder to focus, learn, and think clearly. And then GenAI comes along, and it can act so human-like.
Yeah.
Showing empathy, remembering things, even joking around.
It's easy to forget that you're talking to a computer sometimes.
Exactly. And that can lead to an unhealthy emotional dependence on these systems for some people.
Like they start to trust the AI more than they trust themselves.
Right. And that misplaced trust can have some really bad consequences. We also can't forget about information overload. We're bombarded with so much information all the time. It's already pushing our attention spans to their limits, making it harder to think critically about anything. And now we have this incredibly powerful technology that can make things even more overwhelming.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways about how GenAI affecting our thinking and learning?
Well, based on the research we've looked at, it seems like while GenAI offers a lot of convenience and some real advantages, it also presents some serious challenges to developing and keeping those important cognitive skills.
Okay.
Especially for people who are just starting to learn about something. We're seeing potential impacts on how we find information, how well we reason, how effectively we learn, what creativity looks like, and even how we think about our own thinking.
It's like a tool with two sides. You can't deny how appealing it is to have instant information and all this AI assistance.
Right.
But we need to be aware of the potential costs, especially for people who are still learning.
Absolutely. So here's the final thought I want to leave you with. Knowing that GenAI has these two sides, how can we actively work on our mental fitness?
Our mental fitness?
Yeah, like our cognitive muscles. How do we make sure that we stay in the driver's seat, that we don't just become passive consumers of whatever the AI throws at us?
Right.
I think it's worth taking some time to think about how you personally interact with AI.
Yeah.
And think about what you can do to make sure you're staying engaged, that you're still thinking for yourself.
That's good advice. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.